The first time Catherine Prescott heard a prayer at the Hunter table, she was not entirely certain it was real. She sat across from Oscar Hunter in the low amber light of a kerosene lamp, her hands folded in her lap the way her own mother had taught her 30 years ago in a Virginia parlor that smelled of rose water and old books. She had not planned it. She had simply bowed her head before the meal, folded her hands together beneath the edge of the rough pine table, and closed her eyes. The two boys across from her, Eli, who was 11, and Thomas, who was 9, had gone utterly, shockingly still. And then, in the silence that followed like a held breath, she heard the scrape of two pairs of small hands sliding across the table toward each other. She opened her eyes just a fraction, and through the veil of her lashes she saw them. Eli with his jaw set the way his father's jaw set when something cost him, Thomas with tears tracking soundlessly down his freckled cheeks, both of them with their hands folded just the way hers were. Oscar Hunter sat at the head of the table with his face turned away from her, staring out the dark window at the black Kansas plain, and she could not read him. She had not yet learned to read him. That would take months, and it would cost her nearly everything. But in that moment, watching his sons find their way back to something they had buried with their mother, Catherine Prescott felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the frontier and everything to do with the terrifying, forbidden, desperate suspicion that she was already falling in love with a man who had told her plainly, the very morning she stepped off the stage in Caldwell, that he did not intend for this arrangement to become anything more than practical necessity. That had been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks in which secrets had stacked themselves between them like stones in a wall. 6 weeks in which his dark past had pressed through the plank walls of that farmhouse with the persistence of wind through caulking. 6 weeks in which she had uncovered a betrayal so deep it threatened to unravel everything she thought she understood about why she had come to Kansas in the first place. And now his sons were saying grace. And Oscar Hunter finally turned away from the dark window, and he looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most dangerous thing Catherine Prescott had ever seen, because it looked exactly like a man, realizing he had made a terrible mistake in believing he was finished with love. She had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and the town had announced itself to her through the stage window as a thing that had not entirely decided whether it wanted to survive. The main street was broad and unpaved and rutted from the cattle drives that pushed through every season. There were 2 saloons she could count before the stage stopped rolling, a general store with a faded sign, a land office, and a church whose white paint had mostly surrendered to the wind. The air smelled of dust and cattle, and something underneath both of those things that she would later identify as ambition, the raw, slightly desperate ambition of people who had staked everything on a landscape that did not particularly care whether they succeeded. She was 31 years old. She had been a schoolteacher in Richmond, Virginia for 8 years, and she had watched that life narrow around her the way a river narrows in a drought, the possibilities growing smaller and more shallow each year, until she had sat down one evening and written a response to an advertisement placed in the Richmond Dispatch by a widower in Kansas who needed a capable woman to manage his household and help raise his 2 sons. The advertisement had been practical and unromantic to the point of being almost insulting. He had not promised affection. He had promised a roof, food, honest work, and fair treatment. He had said he was not looking for a wife in the sentimental sense. He needed a partner in the functional sense. Catherine had found this honest enough to be worth the risk. What the advertisement had not told her, what no letter from Oscar Hunter had prepared her for, was the man himself. He was waiting beside his wagon when the stage pulled in. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her 3 or 4 seconds of unguarded observation, and in those seconds she absorbed a great deal. He was tall in the way that men who have spent years doing heavy outdoor work are tall, not with the loose elegance of a man accustomed to leisure, but with a kind of compressed, careful tallness, as though he had learned to carry his height with purpose rather than ease. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that was doing the work his whole face was too guarded to do, which was to announce that he was a man who had been through something and had come out the other side and was not especially interested in discussing it. His eyes, when he finally turned and found her stepping down from the stage, were a gray so deep they were almost navy, and they assessed her with a directness that she found simultaneously rude and oddly respectful, because at least he was not pretending. "Miss Prescott," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Hunter," she answered. It was not either. He took her trunk without asking if she wanted help. She decided that was a reasonable trade for not having to ask. The drive out to the homestead took 2 hours on a road that was mostly a suggestion, and Oscar Hunter spoke perhaps 30 words during that entire time. He told her the boys were named Eli and Thomas. He told her the house had 3 rooms. He told her that they rose before dawn and that breakfast was expected at first light. He told her that he kept a rifle above the back door, and she was welcome to use it if she felt the need. She had asked carefully what might occasion that need, and he had looked at the horizon the way he would look at the horizon every time something made him uncomfortable and said, "Not much anymore." But sometimes. She had not yet understood what he meant. That understanding would come later, wrapped in betrayal and old blood, and a secret that had been kept so long it had grown its own roots. The homestead was larger than she had expected. He had clearly been working it hard for years. There was a main house of rough-hewn timber with a real plank floor, a barn in better repair than many houses she had seen on the drive out, a vegetable garden already planted and coming up in neat rows, a smokehouse, and a chicken coop. The land around it was flat and enormous and so beautiful in its severity that it made her chest ache in a way she had not expected. Eli and Thomas were waiting on the porch. They looked at her the way small animals in unfamiliar territory look at things they have not decided about yet. Eli's face was deliberately neutral in the manner of an older child who has learned that hope is expensive. Thomas was less practiced at hiding himself, and she could see the wanting on his face, the need for something she was not sure he could even have named. She crouched down so she was at their level, which was something she had learned from 8 years of teaching, and she said, "I understand this is your home and I am the new person in it. I intend to earn my place here, but I want you to know I am not trying to replace anyone." Thomas had looked at his brother, and Eli had looked at the ground, and neither of them had said anything. But something in the set of Eli's shoulders had eased by perhaps 1/4 of an inch, which she counted as a beginning. She found out about the wife on her 3rd day. Her name had been Mary. Eli brought her name up without preamble while Catherine was showing him how to multiply fractions, said it the way you might drop something you did not mean to pick up, and quickly looked back at his slate. Thomas, who had been drawing a horse in the margin of his exercise paper, stopped drawing. The air in the kitchen went still. Catherine had looked at the 2 of them and said, very quietly, "Tell me about her if you want to." What had followed was halting and uneven, and clearly the first time either boy had been given outright permission to speak their mother into existence in that kitchen. And by the time Oscar came in from the barn to wash up for supper, she had learned that Mary Hunter had died of a fever 17 months before, that she had made the best cornbread in the county, that she had sung hymns while she worked, that Eli had her eyes, that Thomas had her laugh, and that they had not said grace since she died because grace had been her thing, her particular practice, the way she gathered them all together at the start of each meal and reminded them that they were a family with something to be grateful for. Oscar had stopped in the doorway when he heard Thomas say that last part, and Catherine had looked up and found him watching her with an expression she did not yet have the vocabulary for, but which she would later understand had been composed in equal parts of grief and fear, and something that was the very early, very dangerous beginning of trust. He had not said anything. He had washed his hands and sat down and eaten his supper in silence, which was, she was learning, what Oscar Hunter did with anything that got too close to the interior of him. It was on her fourth day that she began to understand what he had meant by not much anymore but sometimes. She had gone to the general store in Caldwell for supplies, driving the second wagon herself because Oscar was mending a section of fence that could not wait, and she had been loading flour into the wagon bed when the store owner, a wide, garrulous man named Harlan Pruitt, had leaned across his counter and said, with the particular satisfaction of a man who considers gossip a form of public service, "You know who you're working for, don't you?" She had said she knew she was working for a man named Oscar Hunter. Harlan Pruitt had looked at her the way people look at someone who has just revealed an ignorance that delights them. "Hunter," he said, "son. That man killed 2 people before he turned 25. The flour sack in her hands became suddenly very heavy. "In a duel?" she asked, because the year was 1878 and this was Kansas, and that was at least a logical question. "Not exactly," said Harlan Pruitt, and the satisfaction in his voice had curdled into something more complicated, something she would later recognize as the ambivalence of a man who considered Oscar Hunter dangerous but also respected him, which was a common way to feel about Oscar Hunter if you had lived in Caldwell for any length of time. There was a family of claim jumpers. They pushed his father off his land back in '68. His father was killed in the process. Oscar was 19. He went after them. She had driven back to the homestead with the flour and the coffee and the sugar and a completely restructured understanding of the man she was living with. She had not asked him about it that evening. She had cooked supper and helped the boys with their reading and washed the dishes and gone to bed in her small room off the kitchen and lain awake for a long time thinking about the difference between a man who had done violence and a man who was violent, which she had decided were not necessarily the same thing. Over the weeks that followed, she had assembled the fuller picture from pieces. Some pieces came from the boys, who were beginning to trust her enough to chatter. Some came from the neighboring homesteader's wife, a sturdy Finnish woman named Helvi Mekkonen, who had ridden over one afternoon with a pie and an obvious agenda to assess Catherine's suitability, and who had given her more information in 45 minutes than Harlan Pruitt had managed with twice the enthusiasm. And some pieces she assembled herself from observation, because Catherine Prescott had been watching people and reading them all her professional life, and Oscar Hunter, for all his deliberate opacity, was not as unreadable as he believed himself to be. What she assembled was this. Oscar Hunter had grown up on land his father had homesteaded in 1864. In 1868, when Oscar was 19, a group of men with fraudulent land claims had moved on that property while his father was away, and when his father returned and attempted to reclaim his land, one of the men had shot him. Oscar had come home to find his father dying and the strangers on his land, and what had followed had been the kind of thing that happened at the edges of a lawless territory, and was remembered differently by different people, depending on whether they considered Oscar Hunter a murderer or a son doing what sons did when fathers were killed. 2 of the claim jumpers were dead. Oscar was not tried, because the territorial law at the time was both distant and flexible, and because there were witnesses who testified that he had acted in defense of his property and his father's life. He had taken over the homestead, worked it alone for several years, and then married Mary Callahan in 1870, who had come out from Missouri, and who was by all accounts an extraordinary woman who had made a hard life beautiful by sheer force of warmth and faith. When Mary died of fever in the autumn of 1876, something in Oscar Hunter had calcified. He had kept the farm going. He had kept the boys fed and clothed and educated as best he could. He had not drunk himself into ruin or abandoned his responsibilities, because Oscar Hunter was at his core a man of ruthless duty. But he had drawn a line around himself, a boundary she could see as clearly as a fence line, and he had done so with such thoroughness and such conviction that she suspected he had nearly convinced himself it was permanent. She had taken up residence in the household on the wrong side of that fence, and she had known from the first week that if she was going to do any good here for those boys, she would have to find a way through it. She had not anticipated that the way through it would involve her own heart becoming the primary casualty of the effort. She had been working as the household manager, the housekeeper, the tutor, and in the early mornings when the boys were still sleeping and Oscar was already out in the fields, she had taken to sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and her journal, and the particular quality of Kansas dawn light that came through the east window like a slow, serious blessing, and she had been writing down what she noticed. Not about him specifically. She told herself it was not about him specifically. She was writing about the land and the work and the adjustment from Virginia to the frontier and the strangeness of this new life. But a great many of her journal entries somehow contained descriptions of the way Oscar Hunter moved through his own property with a kind of deliberate reverence, the way he touched the soil, the way he spoke to the horses, the way he watched the sky. She had written on the night of her second week that he was like a man who had learned to be present in his body while being entirely absent from his own interior life, and that she found this both sad and compelling in equal measure. On her fifth week, the hidden motive she had not wanted to examine too closely became impossible to ignore. She had gone to the barn after supper to return a tool she had borrowed to fix a loose board on the kitchen shelf, and Oscar had been in there, sitting on a hay bale with his back to her, and he had been holding something. She had very nearly retreated without announcing herself, because he was clearly in the middle of something private, but she had made a sound and he had turned around, and she had seen what he was holding before he could conceal it. It was a small Bible. Worn soft with use, the cover cracked, the pages thickened by years of handling. His hands were wrapped around it the way you hold something that is doing double duty as both object and anchor. She had stood very still in the barn door. Her Bible, he said, and it was not quite an explanation and not quite a confession. It was just a fact he could not outrun fast enough to hide it. "You still read it?" she asked. He looked down at the cover. "I still hold it," he said. "Mostly." She had known then, with the kind of certainty that bypasses the reasoning mind entirely and goes directly to the bone, that she was in serious danger, not from him, from herself. She had gone back to the house and written in her journal for an hour without stopping, and what she had written, she did not read back to herself for a very long time, because she was not ready to see it laid out clearly. The crisis arrived on her sixth week, and it arrived in the shape of a man named Gerald Voss. Gerald Voss rode in on a Thursday afternoon while Oscar was in the south field, and the boys were doing their lessons at the kitchen table. He came up the road without hurry, a lean man in his 40s with a face that had the particular quality of pleasantness worn like a mask over something more calculating, and he reined up in the yard and called out in a carrying voice that he was looking for Oscar Hunter. Catherine came out onto the porch and told him Oscar was in the south field and would be back by supper. She asked if he wanted to leave a message. Gerald Voss looked at her with an assessment that was nothing like the direct, almost professional assessment Oscar had given her the day she arrived. Oscar's gaze had been the gaze of a man taking honest inventory. Voss's gaze was the gaze of a man deciding what he could use. "You the woman he hired on," Voss said. "I manage the household," Catherine said. Voss nodded with the exaggerated respect of a man who finds respect optional. "Tell him Gerald Voss came by. Tell him I have a proposition regarding the North water rights. Tell him I'll be back." He left. Catherine stood on the porch and watched him go and felt the cold, particular weight of something wrong. When Oscar came in from the field, she told him, watching his face while she did. She watched it close in a way that was different from his habitual containment. This was not the closing of a man who did not want to feel things. This was the closing of a man who recognized a specific threat and was making immediate calculations. "What did he look like?" Oscar said. She described him. Oscar sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke again he said, "Gerald Voss is the brother of one of the men who killed my father." The kitchen was very still. "He wants the North water rights," Catherine said carefully. "He wants the property," Oscar said. "The water rights are the handle, the property is the blade." She had looked at him across the table and said, "Then we need to make sure the handle never becomes the blade." The word "we" had happened without her planning it. It hung in the air between them, that small, loaded, three-letter word, and she saw something move through Oscar Hunter's face that she could not entirely interpret. And then he looked down at the table and said quietly, "Miss Prescott." "Catherine," she said, because she had been saying it for a week and he kept reverting. "Catherine," he said, and it was the first time he had said her given name, and even now she would not pretend she did not notice how differently it landed when it was in his voice rather than anyone else's. "I don't have any right to ask you to be involved in my difficulties." "I'm already involved," she said. "I live here. Your difficulties are the household's difficulties. That's the arrangement." He looked at her for a long moment and she looked back at him steadily, the way she had learned to look at things she was not going to allow herself to flinch from. "He'll come back," Oscar said. "I know. He may bring pressure to bear." "What kind of pressure?" Oscar was quiet again. Then he said, "He has the ear of the county land registrar. He has money and I have land. If he can find any irregularity in my claim, real or manufactured, he can create a legal problem that might take years to resolve. I don't have years. I have 2 boys and a farm," she said. "Then we'll need to make sure your claim is absolutely airtight. Do you have all your documentation?" He looked at her as though she had said something in a foreign language. "My documentation." "The original land grant, your father's deed, the survey records, any correspondence with the land office, the records of your claim filing in '64, she paused. "Do you have all of that?" "In a strongbox," he said. "In the bedroom. Then we should look at all of it, tonight after the boys are in bed." The thing that moved across his face then was not the dangerous thing she had seen the night of Grace. It was something more complicated than that. It was the expression of a man having an experience he had not anticipated and did not entirely know how to categorize. And she thought it was the expression of a man realizing that capable was an entirely different and more significant thing. When it was standing in your kitchen, speaking practically about your most urgent problem, than when it was printed in an advertisement in a newspaper. They spent 3 evenings going through his documentation together. The strongbox contained papers he had not opened since his father died, some of them in his father's handwriting, letters from the land office, the original survey, the deed issued by the territorial government in 1864. They spread everything on the kitchen table after the boys were in bed and worked through it systematically, Catherine organizing and cataloging with the precision of a woman who had managed a schoolroom's worth of records for 8 years. Oscar watching her work with an expression he seemed to have stopped bothering to maintain careful control over. On the second evening, she found the problem. It was not a fraud. It was a gap, a period of 8 months in 1867 during which no tax payment was recorded, the year Oscar's father had been ill before the claim jumpers arrived, the year everything had been chaos. It was the kind of gap that Gerald Voss's man at the county land office could use as a lever if he chose. She told Oscar what she had found. He sat very still. "Can it be fixed?" he said. "Not retroactively," she said. "The payment wasn't made because your father was ill and the system was in disorder. But what you can do is file a formal explanation with the land office in Wichita and get it on record before Voss can make use of it. If you go to them first with the explanation, it's a much harder thing for him to weaponize." Oscar looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them made shadows of the planes of his face. "How do you know about land law?" he said. "My father was an attorney," she said. "He believed women should understand the law whether or not the law believed women were capable of understanding it." Something that might, in a more unguarded man, have been a smile moved across the corner of Oscar's mouth and was gone before it fully arrived. "He sounds like a sensible man," Oscar said. "He was the best man I knew," she said, "until he died." She had not meant to say that last part. It came out with a rawness she had not authorized, and she looked down at the papers on the table, and Oscar said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, one of his more significant gifts. He had an extraordinary capacity for giving grief its space without trying to fill it or redirect it, and she thought it was a capacity he had developed the hard way, through the experience of his own grief being stepped on by people who were uncomfortable with it. "I'll go to Wichita," he said, "next week. I think that would be wise. I'll need someone to manage the boys while I'm gone, of course." He stood up from the table and gathered the papers with careful hands and put them back in the strongbox, and then he stood there with the strongbox in his hands for a moment and said, to the strongbox or possibly to the wall behind it, "I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't come." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which she had learned from him. He went to Wichita the following Monday, and he was gone for 4 days, and those 4 days were the most illuminating 4 days Catherine Prescott had yet spent in Kansas. Eli, without his father present to look to for emotional calibration, was more himself than she had yet seen him. He was bright, cutting, funny in the dry, deflating way of certain 11-year-olds who have grown up fast, and he challenged her on points of history with the combative precision of a boy who has been reading everything he can get his hands on, and has not yet learned to pretend he knows less than he does. She liked him enormously and told him so, which made him look as though he was not sure whether to be pleased or suspicious. Thomas, who was the more openly tender of the two, told her on the second evening, while they were washing dishes, that he liked having her there. He said it with the slightly formal delivery of a child who has rehearsed a statement and then decided to just say it, and the combination of the deliberateness and the sincerity of it was so affecting that Catherine had to look out the window at the dark for a moment before she could respond. She told him she liked being there too, which was, she realized as she said it, true in a way that had become much more complicated than she had anticipated. On the third night, Gerald Voss came back. He rode in after dark, which was not the behavior of a man with uncomplicated intentions, and he knocked at the door, and Catherine opened it with her hand already on the rifle she had taken down from above the back door when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She kept the rifle at her side, pointing down but visible. Voss looked at the rifle and then at her and then at the rifle again. "Hunter home," he said. "He is not," she said. "And I'll ask you to state your business or move on, because it's past the boys' bedtime and I have no patience for late calls from men I don't trust." Voss smiled. It did not make him look more trustworthy. "You speak plain," he said. "I was a schoolteacher," she said. "I value clarity." "I'll leave a message then," he said. "Tell Hunter that the window he's thinking about is closing. Tell him he'd do better to discuss terms than to fight a legal battle he can't afford." "I'll tell him you came by," Catherine said. "I'll leave out the part where you tried to intimidate a household of women and children after dark, since I imagine you'd prefer not to have that on record." She closed the door. She stood in the dark kitchen with the rifle in her hands and her heart going at a considerable rate, and she listened until she heard him ride out, and then she put the rifle back above the door and went to check on the boys, who had been woken by the knock and were wide-eyed in the doorway of their room. "Who was it?" Eli said. "A man your father has business with," she said. "Everything is fine. Go back to bed." Thomas looked at her in the lamplight and said, "Were you scared?" She considered this honestly. "A little," she said. "But being scared doesn't mean you can't handle a thing. It just means you're paying attention." She told Oscar about Voss's visit the morning he returned from Wichita, before he had even properly come through the door. She had been watching for the wagon, and she met him in the yard and told him directly, watching his face go through a series of calculations she was not entirely able to follow. "You were alone with the boys," he said. "I was," she said. "I handled it." He was looking at her with that gray, deep, almost navy gaze. "I don't doubt that," he said. "I'm angry that you had to." The distinction he had made, the very specific distinction between doubting her capacity and being angry on her behalf, which was a protection-shaped sentiment rather than a condescension-shaped one, landed in her chest like something she was going to have to deal with later in private, because she was not capable of dealing with it in the middle of the yard on a Tuesday morning. "The filing went well?" she asked. "The land registrar in Wichita was very accommodating once I explained the gap," Oscar said. "He gave me a written acknowledgement that the claim is sound. I have it in the strongbox now. Voss has nowhere to go with this." "Good," she said. "Catherine." He had stopped walking toward the house and was looking at her. The morning light was behind him and she had to squint slightly. "Thank you." "It was the practical thing to do," she said, which was true and also was not the entire truth but was what she could manage. He nodded once, the way he accepted things that were real without making a production of them, and went inside to see his boys. She stood in the yard for a minute after he went in, looking at the flat horizon and the enormous sky, and the way the spring grass was coming up through the brown impatient, persistent waves, and she thought, very clearly, that she was not going to be able to maintain the fiction that this was simply an employment arrangement for very much longer. She was in love with him. She had known it earlier, probably, but this was the morning she admitted it to herself clearly and without negotiation. The way you finally admit something you have been carrying around at an angle so you cannot look directly at it. She was in love with Oscar Hunter, a man who had told her explicitly that he was not looking for love, a man with a dark past and a grief so deep it had become structural, a man who kept other people at the distance of a rifle shot as a matter of habit and survival. She was 31 years old and she had come to Kansas for practical reasons, and she had managed, against everything, to fall entirely in love with the man she had come to keep house for. She went inside and made breakfast. There were several weeks after that in which nothing was acknowledged but everything shifted. The space between them changed. It became smaller and more charged, the way the air before a Kansas thunderstorm becomes smaller and more charged. That particular atmospheric condition where the pressure is building towards something, but the storm has not yet decided to break. He started talking to her at the end of the day, not much, and never about anything obviously consequential, but he started letting her into the part of the evening when he would sit on the porch and watch the sky go dark, and where before she had left him to that alone, she now sometimes sat in the second chair, and they would be quiet together, or they would talk about the work or the boys, or the news from town that Helvi Mekinen brought over when she came to visit. Helvi had assessed the situation between them with the frank appraisal of a woman who had known Oscar Hunter for years and had been transparently, cheerfully rooting for exactly this development from the moment Catherine arrived. And on one afternoon when Oscar was in the barn, and the boys were outside with a dog they had named Captain, Helvi sat across from Catherine at the kitchen table and said, with the specific gentleness of a person who respects you too much to be indirect, "He watches you when you are not looking." Catherine wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I know," she said. "Mary was a wonderful woman," Helvi said, "and he loved her truly. But she has been gone almost 2 years now, and a man like Oscar does not need a saint held up for comparison. He needs a real woman standing in front of him." Catherine was quiet. "He is afraid," Helvi said. "He has been afraid of everything since she died except work, because work you cannot lose the way you can lose people. But he is a man built for family, for having a whole life." She paused. "You know this already." "I know it," Catherine said. "I'm not sure what to do about it." Helvi smiled. "You are already doing it," she said. "You are just doing it very carefully." The evening of the grace was not entirely unplanned on Catherine's part, but it was not calculated either. It came from something genuine, the habit she had brought with her from Virginia, the practice of her own faith, which was not dramatic or performative but was simply real, the way her mother had been real, the way her father had been real, the way the things you were raised to and love tend to become simply part of you rather than things you choose. She had bowed her head. She had folded her hands. She had done it because it was the right time of day and the meal was on the table, and the light was the evening gold light she had come to associate with peace, even in a place that had cost her a great deal of peace to arrive at. And the boys had followed. And Oscar had turned from the window. After the supper, after the boys were in bed, she was washing the dishes and the house was quiet, and she was thinking about what had happened at the table and what it meant, and she heard Oscar come into the kitchen behind her and stop. She kept washing the dish in her hands. "They did that themselves," she said. "I didn't ask them to." "I know," he said. "It seemed important not to make a fuss of it, not to mark it too much." "That was the right instinct," he said. She heard him move, heard the sound of him sitting down at the table, which was behind her and to the left, and she kept washing dishes because something about the quality of the silence behind her said that he was working up to something and she should not turn around and interrupt the process. She had learned this about him. He needed running room to get to a thing. If you turned to face it too soon, he stopped. "When Mary died," he said, and stopped. She went on washing. "When she died," he said again, "the boys stopped saying grace. I didn't ask them to stop, they just did. I think because they associated it with her in such a complete way that doing it felt like pretending she was still there, and pretending was worse than nothing." He paused. "I thought maybe they would start again when they were ready, but it had been 17 months. She set the dish down carefully. "They weren't ready before tonight," she said. "No," he said, "they weren't." And then after a pause, "You didn't try to push them toward it." "That's not how it works," she said, "with children or with grief. You can't push people toward healing. You can only make it possible." There was a long silence. She had turned away from the wash basin now and was standing with her back to him and her hands on the edge of the counter. And she was not turning around because she was not certain she could maintain her composure if she saw his face. "Catherine," he said. She turned around. The lamp on the table made its amber circle, and he was sitting inside it, and his face was open in a way she had not seen before. Not the deliberate opening of a man making a controlled decision, but the involuntary opening of a man who has run out of the ability to keep something closed. "I told you when you arrived that I wasn't looking for anything beyond the practical arrangement," he said. "You did," she said. "I remember. I want to be honest with you," he said. "It's the only thing I know how to be, and it's the only thing I think is fair to you because you have been honest with me from the first day." He was looking at the table now, not at her. "What I told you in the beginning was true when I said it. I had convinced myself it was going to stay true." He paused. "I was wrong." She was very still. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to do this in a way that doesn't risk everything. Because everything I have is already at risk every single season with the weather and the land and now Voss, and adding the risk of another person, another loss, another thing that matters enough to break you when it's gone." He stopped. "I am telling you this so you understand why I am slow and why I am careful and why I am not an easy man." "I know you are not an easy man," she said. He looked up at her then. "I didn't come to Kansas for easy," she said. The thing that happened to his face then was not something she could describe in language with any precision. It was the thing that happens to a person's face when they have been holding something at bay for a long time and they let it stop. The effort of the holding stops, and what's underneath it comes through. And what was underneath Oscar Hunter's careful, controlled, guarded face was a man with more feeling in him than she had imagined even in her most generous assessments. He stood up from the table. She was aware of the distance between them, how it was different from the distances of the preceding weeks, and then it was less, and then he was standing in front of her and looking down at her with that deep gray gaze, and there was nothing careful or managed about it at all, and he said very quietly, "I don't know how to go slowly with this. I've been going slowly for weeks and I'm not sure it's working." "It's not," she said. He kissed her. It was not, as first kisses go, tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had been resisting a thing long enough that, when the resistance finally ended, the thing came through with everything that had been compressed behind it. And it was the most honest thing Catherine Prescott had experienced in a very long time, which was saying something, because she had been in the presence of a great deal of honesty over the preceding weeks. She put her hands flat against his chest and felt the particular solidity of him and thought, with the small rational part of her that was still operating, that this was entirely irreversible, and she was entirely glad. They stood in the kitchen in the amber lamplight for a long time after that, not speaking, which was, with Oscar Hunter, always a more eloquent choice than speaking would have been. Gerald Voss came back one final time, 3 weeks later. He came in the middle of the afternoon with 2 other men whose primary purpose was to look large and present, and he rode into the yard with the particular confidence of a man who believes he is holding a better hand than he actually has. Oscar was at the fence line and came in when he saw the riders, and Catherine was on the porch with her arms folded, having heard them coming and made the calculation that meeting them outside was preferable to letting them interpret her absence as retreat. Voss looked at the 2 of them standing there together and did the kind of recalculation that comes with seeing a situation differently than you expected. "Hunter," he said, "I heard you went to Wichita." "I did," Oscar said. "I heard you filed some paperwork." "I cleared up an administrative gap in my father's claim record," Oscar said. "The land registrar acknowledged the claim as sound. In writing, I have the document." Voss looked at the men beside him. He looked back at Oscar. He looked at Catherine, and she returned his gaze with the calm, level attention of a woman who had faced him down in the dark with a rifle and was not significantly more impressed with him now. "I'm not a violent man," Voss said. "Good," Oscar said. "Neither am I, in the general way of things." There was a silence between them that was dense with history, the ghost of Voss's brother, the ghost of Oscar's father, the 18-year-old ghost of a territorial law that had not protected anyone properly on either side. "The water rights," Voss said. "There might be a fair price for a limited easement." "There might be," Oscar said, "if you're prepared to have that conversation through proper legal channels and in daylight." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Catherine again. Then he turned his horse around, and his 2 large companions turned their horses around, and they went back down the road. Oscar watched until they were gone. Then he turned to Catherine and said, "That's the last of it, I think." "I think so too," she said. He looked at her standing on his porch in the afternoon light and said, "You know, you are not at all what I expected." "What did you expect?" she said. "Someone more cautious," he said. "I'm extremely cautious," she said. "I'm cautious about all the important things. I just don't confuse caution with passivity." The corner of his mouth moved. It was still not quite a smile, but it was closer than it had ever been. "No," he said. "You certainly do not." Summer came over the Kansas plain like a long, slow, golden argument for staying, and Catherine found herself staying in ways that had nothing to do anymore with the original practical arrangement. She was staying in the way that a person stays in a place that has become their own, the way you cannot quite separate yourself from a landscape once it has gotten into the particular grammar of your daily life, the rhythm of its light and wind and smell. She was teaching the boys in the mornings, and they were both remarkable students in different ways. Eli had the analytical mind that wanted to take things apart to understand them, and could be led anywhere as long as you showed him the mechanism. Thomas had the synthetic mind, the one that wanted to see how things fit together, and he had taken to drawing maps of the property with a cartographic ambition that far exceeded the tools available to him, using whatever scraps of paper he could find, and a set of charcoal pencils that Catherine had sent away to Wichita for as a surprise. Thomas had cried when she gave him the pencils. Eli had observed this with the careful, complex expression of an older brother who wants to seem above being moved and is not. Oscar had watched from the doorway of the barn, and he had looked at her with that open, unguarded look that she was seeing more of now, the look that he had stopped trying to prevent. They had long evenings on the porch. They talked about everything: his father, his marriage to Mary, her years in Virginia, her family, the war's effect on Richmond, her decision to respond to his advertisement, which he still seemed to find slightly incredible. She told him about reading it at the kitchen table of her rented room in Richmond on a Wednesday morning, the light thin and gray through the window, the coffee cold, the sense she had been having for some time that she was living in a life that was too small for what she actually was, and the way the advertisement, with its unadorned practicality and its complete absence of pretense, had seemed to be speaking directly to something in her that was tired of pretense. He told her about the first winter after Mary died, which was not something he had told anyone, the way the house had been loud with silence, the way the boys had moved around in it like small boats in open water, none of them knowing where to anchor. He told her about the night Eli had come and gotten into bed beside him without a word, just pushed himself under the quilt and lay there rigid and wakeful, and how Oscar had lain there too, rigid and wakeful, for hours, and how that had been both the worst night of the first year and also, in some strange way, the beginning of the way through it. She had told him about her own grief, her father 3 years before she left Virginia, and the particular grief of watching her mother diminish afterward, the way some people are so built for a specific partnership that, when the other half of it is gone, they simply begin the quiet process of following. Her mother had died 10 months after her father, which the doctor had called heart failure, and which Catherine privately called a broken heart and thought was probably more accurate. Oscar had listened to this with the particular quality of attention he gave to the things she told him that mattered, which was a complete, undivided attention that made her feel both seen and slightly exposed, because she was not entirely accustomed to being listened to that carefully. He had taken her hand then, on the porch, without saying anything, the way he did things that mattered, without a great deal of ceremony, and she had held his hand in the dark with the prairie wind moving through the grass and the coyotes starting up somewhere to the south, and she had thought that this was what home felt like. Not the house, though the house was real, but this specific quality of being where you were supposed to be. He asked her to marry him in August. He did it in the early morning, before the boys were up, while she was at the kitchen table with her coffee. He came in from the barn where he had already been working for an hour in the way he did in summer, when the heat later in the day made the heavier work impossible, and he sat down across from her and he folded his hands on the table in front of him and looked at them for a moment and then looked at her. She waited. She had learned to wait for him. "I don't want you to be my housekeeper," he said. "I know," she said. "I want you to be my wife," he said. "I want Eli and Thomas to have a mother. I want this to be what it already is, except honestly and properly, with nothing conditional about it." He paused. "I understand if you need time to consider." "Oscar," she said. "Yes." "I decided this in the 5th week," she said. "I've been waiting for you to catch up." He looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved again, and this time it kept going, and it became a real smile, the first complete, unguarded smile she had seen from him, and it was devastating in the best possible way, because it changed his whole face. It gave back something to him that grief had been holding for a long time, and she thought it was probably close to what he had looked like before. "Yes, then," he said. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." They were married in September in Caldwell, in the white-painted church that had mostly surrendered its paint to the wind. The minister was a patient, solid man named Reverend Branch, who had been in Caldwell long enough to have married and buried a considerable portion of its population, and who performed the ceremony with a plain dignity that suited them both. Helvie Mekinen stood up for Catherine and wept openly and unashamedly throughout, which she later described as tears of vindicated judgment. Eli and Thomas stood together in the front pew in their best clothes, which Catherine had brushed and pressed the evening before while they submitted to the process, with the resigned tolerance of boys for whom formal clothing is an intermittent injustice. Eli was straight and still and watching his father with an expression that was too old for 11, but not too old for a boy who had carried what he had carried. Thomas, who was less invested in appearing unmoved, had cried, but quietly with his chin up, which was a particular and touching form of dignity. After the ceremony, standing in front of the church in the September light with Caldwell doing its regular business around them in the absolute indifference of a frontier town to sentiment, Oscar had put his hand at the small of her back and bent down slightly to say, close to her ear, "We should probably tell Harlan Prout before he hears it from someone else. He'll never forgive us if he's not among the first to know." She had laughed, which was the best possible start to the rest of her life. The autumn was a long, golden, generous autumn, the kind the prairie produced in its good years when the harvest was full, and the air had that particular clean urgency of the season turning. Catherine found her days taking on a shape that was entirely her own, different from Virginia in almost every particular, but hers in a way that Virginia had not been for a long time. She ran the household with the organization she had brought from teaching, the boys' education proceeding through the mornings with a rigor that delighted Eli and a patience that drew Thomas along. She had written to Wichita for more books, and the order had arrived in a crate that Eli had helped her unpack with a reverence appropriate to a significant occasion. Oscar was different in small, constant ways. He talked more. Not a great deal. He was never going to be a man who talked a great deal, but more and with less distance. He laughed more than she had seen him laugh in the first weeks, usually at something the boys said or something she said, and the laugh was a very good laugh, the kind that was unself-conscious and direct. The boys, too, were different. The household had a quality it had not had, an ease, a warmth that was not performed but simply present, the way a room warms when you put enough people who love each other into it. They said grace at every meal now, without prompting, Eli sometimes the one who initiated it, folding his hands and bowing his head with a seriousness that had nothing performative in it, that was simply his own. Catherine had watched this from across the table one evening and thought about the mother those two boys had lost, and she had thought about what it meant to be the woman who had come after, who was not trying to be what Mary had been because that would have been both impossible and wrong, but who was simply trying to be fully and honestly herself, and hoped that was enough. She had decided that it was. She had decided this with the particular conviction of a woman who has made a hard choice clearly, and is not going back. Helvie Mekinen came in the October with the pie and stayed for the afternoon and told Catherine, with an air of delivering an accurate diagnosis, "You look like a woman who has settled into herself. This is a good thing. Many women never manage it." Catherine had thought about this. "I had to come to Kansas to do it," she said. "Yes," Helvie said. "Sometimes you have to go a long way to arrive somewhere." Winter came to the prairie with its full, serious force in November, the first real blizzard arriving in the second week, with the kind of commitment that reminded everyone on the frontier exactly where they stood in relation to the landscape. The house held. Oscar had built it to hold, and it held, and they were inside it together for 3 days of wind and snow and enforced proximity that was not hardship so much as it was its own kind of gift. Eli used the time to read everything he could get to. Thomas drew maps of imaginary places, and then drew maps of real places, and then asked Oscar if they could make a proper map of the whole farm in the spring. And Oscar said yes with such directness and such evident pleasure at being asked, that Thomas looked at his father with an expression of complete, uncomplicated happiness that made Catherine have to attend to the soup on the stove. In the evenings, Oscar read aloud to all of them, which was something Catherine had suggested, and he had taken to with a thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting for the suggestion. He read from a Robinson Crusoe that had been in the house from before, and from a copy of Roughing It by Mark Twain that Catherine had brought from Virginia, and from the Bible, Mary's Bible, that he had started bringing to the table in the evenings. The boys listened to the Bible passages with the particular quality of children who are hearing something they have a complicated relationship with, still tender in some ways, but willing, and Catherine thought that this was healing of a specific and important kind. She found out she was expecting a child in December. She told Oscar on a Saturday evening after the boys were in bed, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, and she told him simply and directly because that was the only way she knew how to tell him things, and she watched his face while she did. His face did what it had done in the kitchen the night she did not turn around, the involuntary opening, except that this time it went further, past open, past the territory of controlled feeling, all the way to the place where what was inside a person was completely visible, and there were no controls on it at all. His face in that moment was the face of a man who had been given back something he had not allowed himself to believe was available to him. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He said, "Catherine," she said, "I know." He said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" She said, "I'm perfectly well. I'm entirely well." He looked at their hands together on the table for a long time, and she let him, because whatever was happening in him in this moment was his own, and she had learned that the kindest thing she could do with Oscar Hunter's most significant interior moments was to be present without requiring him to manage her experience of them. He said, finally, "Thomas will be absolutely beside himself." She laughed. He looked up at her when she laughed, and the expression on his face was one she would carry for the rest of her life. They told the boys the next morning at breakfast. Thomas was, in fact, absolutely beside himself. He stood up from the table and sat back down and then stood up again and asked 3 questions simultaneously, none of which were entirely articulate, and then sat back down and said, with a gravity that was meant to cover the excitement and did not, "I think it should be a boy." Eli, who had absorbed the news with his characteristic stillness, said, "You don't get to decide that, Thomas." "I know that," Thomas said. "I'm just saying what I think." "What you think is not a determining factor," Eli said, with the particular pleasure of an older brother identifying a logical flaw. Catherine looked at Oscar across the table and he looked at her, and the look between them contained a whole private conversation about how extraordinary these 2 boys were, and what an unexpected grace it was to be their family. Spring returned to Kansas the way it always did, as though the winter had been a held breath and this was the release. The grass came back in that patient, persistent wave. The garden went in. The fields were plowed and planted. Captain the dog had puppies, which produced a household management challenge of considerable complexity. Since both boys wanted to keep all 5 of them, and Oscar and Catherine were conducting a negotiation about the number that could reasonably be absorbed into a working farm. They settled on 2. Catherine, who was now visibly expecting, and who had declined to let this slow her down significantly, had helped Helvie Mekinen start a small lending library in Caldwell, using donated books and a corner of the general store that Harlan Prout had agreed to make available, with a graciousness that he attempted to make seem smaller than it was. The library had 3 shelves by spring, and a waiting list for certain volumes that told her something about the reading hunger of a frontier community given the opportunity. Oscar had ridden into town one Saturday and come back with a 4th bookshelf he had commissioned from the carpenter, which he installed in the library with the boys' help on a Sunday morning, and which Harlan Prout accepted the donation of with an air of a man reluctantly admitting that things had turned out better than expected. The baby arrived in July. He arrived on a Thursday morning with the thoroughness and the urgency of someone who had been waiting an adequate amount of time and was done waiting, and Helvie Mekinen was there, which was good because Oscar, for all his capability in every other frontier situation, was not an asset in the immediate practical circumstances of a birth, and Catherine had managed him to the porch with a kind of patient firmness that he accepted because he recognized when he was outclassed. The child was a boy, as Thomas had unreasonably but accurately predicted, a solid, roaring, entirely healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's definite chin, and he was placed in Oscar's arms within the first half-hour of his life, and Oscar Hunter held him with the particular careful enormity of a man handling something that has changed the entire geometry of his world. They named him James, which was Catherine's father's name, and Oscar's middle name, which they discovered in the 2nd week of knowing each other and which had seemed, even then, before they were anything other than employer and employee, like a notable coincidence. Thomas had held James with a solemnity and a care that suggested he had been practicing for this specific responsibility without knowing it. Eli had held him more briefly and more awkwardly, the way older children hold new babies when they are trying to seem less affected than they are. And James had looked up at Eli with the unfocused, profound attention of the very newly born. And something in Eli's carefully maintained composure had simply given way entirely. Later that evening, after Helvey had gone home and the boys were in bed and James was sleeping in the cradle Oscar had built in March, Catherine was propped up in bed with the particular exhausted but awake quality of a woman who has just done a very large thing and whose body is still processing it. And Oscar was sitting in the chair by the window, and they were both just being in the room with the sleeping baby and the fading day, not talking. Oscar said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "That first morning," he said, "when I was waiting for the stage, I had decided the night before to send a letter retracting the advertisement." She looked at him. "I had convinced myself it was a mistake," he said, "that bringing a stranger into the house was not fair to the boys and that I was being selfish and that I should figure out another way. I had written the letter. I was going to post it before the stage arrived." "What stopped you?" she said. "I didn't send it in time," he said. "The stage was early. I was still at the land office when it came in." He looked at her across the room. "I stood outside and I thought about going home and just telling you when you stepped off that there had been a mistake, and then I didn't." "Why not?" she said. "Because you got off the stage and you looked at me," he said, "and you weren't frightened and you weren't trying to charm me and you weren't performing anything. You just looked at me the way you look at everything, like you were simply determining what was actually there. And I thought, if I send that woman away, I will regret it for the rest of my life." Catherine looked at the sleeping baby in the cradle and at the man in the chair by the window and at the summer dark outside and the lamplight in the room and the whole long, complicated, beautiful, improbable story of how they had arrived at this specific Thursday evening. "You were right," she said. "You would have." He smiled fully, that complete and devastating smile, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had come a very long way from Richmond, Virginia, for something that had turned out to be exactly the right thing. The following years built themselves out with the particular quality of a life that has found its proper structure and is now filling in with substance. Eli turned 14 in the spring 2 years after James was born, and he had grown into himself in the way that children grow into themselves when they are seen clearly and given the room for it. He was sharp and argumentative in the best possible way, the way that meant he was thinking, and he had developed a passion for law that Catherine thought had something to do with the Voss situation, with watching his father navigate a legal threat and come out the other side by knowing the rules and using them. Oscar had begun corresponding with a lawyer in Wichita on Eli's behalf about the possibility of reading law there when Eli was old enough. The lawyer had written back with considerable enthusiasm about the quality of the questions Eli had submitted in his initial letter, and Oscar had brought the letter to supper and read it aloud, and Eli had listened with his jaw doing the thing Oscar's jaw did when something cost him to feel, and he was not going to let it show, which meant it meant an enormous amount to him. Thomas, at 12, was producing maps of genuine accuracy and had begun surveying the neighboring farms at their owner's request, using a transit level he had saved for and ordered from a catalog in Kansas City. He charged a modest fee, which he saved toward the professional surveying equipment he intended to own before he was 20, and which Helvey Mekinen told everyone in Caldwell about with the possessive pride of someone who had been nearby at the start of a significant thing. James, who was 2 and occupied the household with the complete, benevolent tyranny of a healthy, loved toddler, had recently added his grandfather James's Bible to the list of objects he considered personally his, and could be found at any given time carrying it around with both arms, walking with the serious, determined gait of a person engaged in important transport. Oscar had found this happening one afternoon and had crouched down to James's level and asked where he was going with the Bible, and James had said, with great conviction, "Mine," which was not exactly wrong and was entirely James. Catherine had been expecting her second child through that winter, and the second baby arrived the following February on a morning so cold the ice on the inside of the window had to be cleared with a rag before you could see the yard, which seemed like an interesting introduction to Kansas. This child was a girl. They named her Alina for Oscar's mother, who had died when he was 12, and of whom he spoke rarely but with a love that had not diminished with the distance of time, and the naming of her seemed to resolve something in him that had been waiting for resolution, some old, quiet grief that did not need a great deal, just the acknowledgement of this specific kind of continuity. Alina from her first weeks was a person of distinct opinions, delivered with a clarity and a volume that suggested she had inherited something from both sides equally. Thomas, who had wanted a sister, was proved entirely right in his wanting and spent a considerable portion of his time explaining this to anyone who would listen. Eli regarded his new sister with the careful assessment he brought to everything, and then announced, to no one in particular, that she was quite good, which from Eli was an extraordinary review. Oscar held Alina the way he had held James, with that enormous careful gravity, and looked at her for a long time and then looked at Catherine and said, "How did all of this happen?" "You placed an advertisement," Catherine said. He laughed. It was the good laugh, the complete one, and she was 3 years into hearing it, and it had not lost any of its effect. Helvie Mekinen came the following week and held Alina, and provided her assessment that Alina was going to be a force of nature, based on the evidence of her first week of life, and that the Hunter household was extremely well equipped for this. Catherine had looked around the kitchen while Helvie said this, at the shelves of books and the boys' slates, and the drying herbs from the garden and the Bible on the windowsill, and the photographs they had taken in Wichita the previous spring. Oscar and Catherine and Eli and Thomas and James in front of a white backdrop, the family they had assembled out of grief and practicality, and something neither of them had been able to name until it named itself. The lending library in Caldwell had grown to occupy its own corner of a proper building by the time Alina was born. Catherine was still its primary force, still corresponding with publishers in Kansas City and St. Louis about donations, still organizing the waiting lists that told her everything she needed to know about what people were hungry for. She had also, by this point, established a small school in Caldwell that was separate from the one-room public school, offering evening classes for adults who had not had the opportunity to learn to read and write, and the attendance at these classes was the thing she was most privately proud of. Oscar had not been surprised by this development. He had simply allocated a portion of the barn one evening for the storage of the school's materials, and said that if she needed a space built onto the church for the evening classes, he and Thomas could manage it in the fall when the farm work eased. She had looked at him standing there in the barn with the practicality of a man who has been watching his wife and understood exactly who she was and what she needed, and she had said, "You are the best man I know," which was true and which she had decided was worth saying. He had looked at her with that unguarded look and said, "You said the same thing about your father." "You are both the best man I know," she said, "in different years." He had come over and kissed her in the barn, which was where they had had a considerable number of their most significant exchanges, and which seemed, by this point, to be their particular place. The fall of 1882 brought Eli's 16th birthday and the beginning of preparations for his eventual departure for Wichita, which was still 2 years away, but which they were treating with appropriate seriousness. Oscar corresponding with the lawyer about what Eli should be studying in the interim, and Catherine expanding his curriculum accordingly. Eli participated in these preparations with the combined anticipation and terror of someone about to begin the actual life they have been growing toward, and he had moments of uncertainty that he brought to Catherine, in the way he had come to bring her things he could not quite bring to his father, not because he could not trust his father with them, but because some things were easier to say to someone who was not your father, and she had become, over 4 years, the person he could say those things to. She had told him on one of these evenings that the fact that he was uncertain was evidence that he understood the size of what he was undertaking, and that understanding the size of a thing was the beginning of being able to do it properly. Eli had listened to this with his characteristic stillness, and then said, "That actually helps," in the tone of a person who is slightly annoyed to have been helped because it means he has to recalibrate his position. Thomas was 14, and his maps were on the walls of the Caldwell Land Office and the county assessor's office, where they were used as working reference documents, which he received with the equanimity of a person who is not surprised by competence in himself, because he has always been prepared to work for it. He had also recently been spending a certain amount of time in the vicinity of Helvie Meckinen's daughter, Aino, who was 14 herself, and who regarded Thomas with the direct, assessing regard of her mother, which Catherine thought was either a very good sign or a very early complication, depending on how the next few years went. She decided to watch the situation with interest and without interference. James was 4 and had the farm memorized, every fence line, every field, every animal, the entire geography of the world as he understood it, and he followed his father around in the fields with an intensity of attention that Oscar bore with the same patient completeness he gave to everything that mattered to him. James had his father's eyes and his mother's certainty, and he was forming into a person who was going to make a great deal of things happen in his life, which Catherine thought with a combination of anticipation and the quiet preparatory kind of awe. Alina was 2 and was, as Helvie had predicted, a force of nature. She had opinions about everything, delivered them to everyone, and accepted the occasional gentle correction of her methods with the tolerant expression of a person who has concluded that the people around her mean well even when they are wrong. Oscar found her absolutely delightful and was not even slightly good at pretending otherwise, which made Eli observe with dry accuracy that Alina had already worked out something that even he had taken years to manage. The spring of 1883 brought a drought, the kind the prairie was capable of, long and hot and serious, and the farm went through a difficult summer. The fields produced less than they should have. The water in the North Creek dropped to a trickle. Oscar managed the difficulty with the steady resourcefulness of a man who has been working this land long enough to know that bad years are part of the contract, and that the contract is still worth holding. Catherine managed the household economy with the same precision she had brought to his land claim 4 years earlier, finding every place where something could be preserved or extended or substituted, and she did it without drama or complaint, which was, Oscar told her one evening, the most useful quality a person could have in a difficult year. She had said, "I come from a practical family." He had said, "You come from an extraordinary family." She had said, "My father would have liked you." He had said, "Your father raised you. He would have liked anyone you chose." The rain returned in September, good fall rains, the soil drinking them in with the deep and obvious relief of a living thing that has been very thirsty. The grass came back. The creek rose. The root vegetables that had managed through the dry summer came up solid and good. Oscar stood in the field in the September rain and let it fall on him, and Catherine watched him from the porch and thought about the word she had come to use for what she felt in this life, which was sufficiency, not the small, pinched sufficiency of just enough, but the deep sufficiency of a life so full that you felt the fullness of it even in the hard years. That winter was quiet in the good way. The house was full. Eli was deep in his studies, working through the law texts Oscar's Wichita correspondent had recommended. Thomas had graduated to instruments he had traded for himself and was dreaming about a survey he wanted to do in the spring. James had learned to read and was doing so with the intensity of someone who has discovered a tool and cannot stop using it. Alina had decided to teach her rag doll to read as well, which was proceeding with varying results. On a January evening, with the snow against the windows and the fire going and all 4 children occupied in their respective corners of the main room. Oscar looked up from the accounts he was working on and looked at Catherine and said, "Are you happy?" She looked at him across the table, this man she had made her life with, this man she had come to through a practical advertisement and a 2-hour drive on a road that was mostly a suggestion and 6 weeks of careful mutual appraisal, and one evening in a kitchen when she had folded her hands before a meal and everything had changed. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "So am I," he said. "I want you to know that." She reached across the table and put her hand on his and said, "I know." Outside, the Kansas winter pressed at the walls with its full, serious force, and inside the lamp burned and the children were occupied with their various occupations, and the fire was sound. And Catherine Prescott Hunter, who had come from Richmond, Virginia, with a trunk and a willingness to take a practical risk on an impractical hope, thought that she had in fact gotten exactly what she had come for, and then a great deal more besides. She bowed her head before supper that evening, folded her hands the way she always did, the way her mother had taught her, and all 4 children followed without being asked, as they always did now, as naturally as breathing, as reliably as the seasons. And across the table Oscar Hunter bowed his head too, and she thought about how love arrives sometimes in forms you would not have chosen, and through doors you would not have expected to find yourself walking through, and how the places it takes you to are almost never the places you imagine but are very often better, and how it is worth every risk and every fear, and every careful, frightened, honest conversation in a lamplit kitchen in Kansas to arrive at a Thursday evening in January with the snow at the windows, and your family gathered around a table, and all of them giving thanks.